People often say a man's home is his castle, to which Leonard would probably respond, "Do you have a castle? No? Then please shush." Phase 3. Leonard, the Dragonborn hero? I am a hero. This leg of Leonard's journey wraps up what I would consider the main story arc for this character. Of course, at the start of this phase, chapter 7, he has already achieved his initial goals of gaining influence in both the nefarious criminal organisations, but also in the various holds. He is now the Thane of everywhere.
I heard you were at the wedding of the Emperor's cousin, in Solitude? Gods, that must have been horrible.
Well, yes, it's the sort of thing you get invited to when you're a Thane. But like many successful people, lots is just not enough. He wants more. In fact, let's face it, he wants all. And so his search for influence and symbols of his status continue. I want a castle. And as we know, this attempt to consolidate and build his power base, his influence within Skyrim, takes him outside of Skyrim, sometimes outside of the landmass itself, but occasionally out of Nirn itself. He spends a strange amount of time being sent to places that most mortals will never visit. And whilst once upon a time Leonard would have been massively, if not totally out of his depth in such places, he is now a little less mundane than he used to be. This phase of the story is where Leonard starts to complete that transformation that began way back in chapter 4. He is beginning to become an extraordinary type of person. He's no longer relying on mundane skills, physical skills that you would learn like stealth, alchemy, this sort of thing. He is now beginning to add to his toolset. So whilst he still uses stealth, poison, manipulation, those sort of things, he's actually beginning to use a lot more magic, and by the end, he's also using shouts. Now those of you who are actually looking at the screen right now may have noticed that I'm no longer listing Inigo as one of the tools that Leonard uses, and this is for two reasons. The first reason is that throughout this phase, throughout these 3 chapters, Leonard becomes much more independent. He can actually achieve his aims without Inigo, and sometimes he's actually better off without Inigo because he can remain undetected and has all the tools he needs to get whatever needs doing done. Now, I'm not saying Inigo is useless, in fact far from it. There are plenty of moments when things go wrong, and of course that's why Leonard wants him there. He is a great fighter, he's a great backup plan at times, but at this stage you'll start to notice that there are situations that Leonard probably could have handled himself even without Inigo, but he still runs back to Inigo. And there are even cases where Inigo has caused the problem. He's the one that got spotted, and so you might think, you know what, Leonard should go it alone even more than he started to do so, and yet he doesn't. Why? Well, that's the second reason I don't list him as a tool, because Leonard sees him as a friend now. That is it, that he no longer thinks of him as hired help, as a bodyguard. He sees him as a trusted companion. In fact, the only person Leonard has ever truly trusted and really enjoyed having around. They're two radically different people, massively different in every single way, but Leonard likes Inigo, and he's just much more comfortable when he's around. He's probably the only person Leonard would take risks for. You know, I mean, Leonard will take risks for his own benefit, but Inigo is someone Leonard would actually take risks for. The only person I can think of, to be honest. Leonard's relationship with Inigo is pretty much the only character development that occurred throughout the 9 chapters. in all of the ways, Leonard is still the same self-centered egomaniac that he was back in Chapter 1. Of course, he's a much more capable character now. He may not have grown in personality, but he has definitely grown in power, and you can see that by the difference in the sorts of challenges he faces. At this stage of the playthrough, Leonard rarely worried about getting caught. He was absolutely superb at remaining undetected, and he just got better and better and better. So it was the more upfront, direct combat situations where he was still a little, well, he was still very ill-equipped for, although, again, depending on his adversary. The average person, he just didn't need to fight them. He could neutralize them a variety of ways and often did so. And so the only real challenges he faced at this stage were things like dragons and other creatures that were immune to his illusion magic and were either immune or massively resistant to things like his poisons. The creatures that true heroes would be fighting, so to speak. Now that might not have seemed obvious at the start of Chapter 7. After all, we just ended Chapter 6, where Leonard had finally become the Thane of Everywhere after going through the Civil War quest, and still felt like a character who was out of his depth in many circumstances. And he was. But of course he did end Chapter 6 with, showing signs of using illusion magic in a far more effective and overt way. But much more importantly, from the perspective of Leonard's power and his the tools he had at his disposal to deal with situations, Chapter 7 did involve a bit of a power spike. We'll talk about that a little later though. Getting into Chapter 7 was fairly easy. Leonard had been acquiring properties throughout Skyrim and now owned quite a lot of real estate, but he still had his eyes on gaining more, and he wanted something a bit more substantial, something that would be very different. He wanted a castle. And of course the only castle he knew in Skyrim that wasn't a total ruin was the castle currently inhabited by the Volkihar vampire clan. And so in what I now consider typical Leonard style, he hatches a plan to manipulate the local vampire slayers into clearing the castle for him. Basically, he pretends to be a vampire slayer and does whatever is required to get the Dawn Guard to the castle so that they storm it and kill all the vampires. Then, in the aftermath of the battle, he would step forward and as the Thane of Hafingar, he would claim the castle on behalf of Elisif and promise that he would use the place to defend against vampires in that hold, etc, etc. Of course, he would probably not mention that to Elisif, or if she asked, he'd say he claimed it on behalf of the Dawn Guard and was using it to protect her hold, and hopefully no one would really look too deeply into it, and after a while, possession is 9/10 of the law, etc, etc, and he'd have a castle. Of course, it ended up not being that simple, and there were a few problems along the way, both for Leonard and myself as the author of this particular story. The problem for me was the soul cairn. I'd sort of forgotten the fact that you have to give up your soul or become a vampire to enter the soul cairn without dying. This presented a fairly major problem for me because of course Leonard would agree to neither. In fact, to be honest, when looking at the situation as it presented itself, I couldn't imagine Leonard agreeing to go into the soul cairn regardless, even if he could have gone in there without giving up his soul or becoming a vampire. His thought process was, hey Serana, you go find Mummy, you're the vampire, you go in there, I've done my bit, you do your bit. Now as I said, I had forgotten that, believe it or not, and it did present a fairly major problem. Leonard was never going to take either of those choices. He was never going to become a vampire and he was never going to give up half of his soul. In fact, to be honest, like I've said, I can't really see him entering the Soul Cairn. The only reasonable course of action for Leonard, the only real choice whilst being in character, was to say nope and leave. Of course, that would have meant the end of the chapter, and I didn't want to do that. I felt that would have been unfulfilling. It might have been slightly amusing, but it of course would have then closed off quite a lot of the content from that chapter, because I can't imagine him coming back at a later date. It would also have changed things in chapter 8 and 9. Looking back on it, I actually think the power spike that comes in chapter 7 was almost essential to make chapters 8 and 9 work. I didn't think of that at the time, but looking back on it, I am really glad that I decided I couldn't end chapter 7 there. I had to get Leonard into the Soul Cairn, but there was no way I could get Leonard to willingly make that choice. That was never going to happen. So this time, I did machinima it a little. Look, I have a rule, and that rule is do not jump into glowing purple portals of oblivion, okay? I didn't know I had that rule before, but trust me, it's always been there. What do you mean you were trying to be more like Inigo? You shoved me off a set of stairs into a portal. We have absolute... Whoa! Please don't push me. Whoa! Okay. This... Don't... But... Oh. Okay, yes, that's not... So, Serana accidentally, totally not on purpose, shoves Leonard into the Soul Cairn, and he now finds himself, well, completely out of his comfort zone. I mean, let's face it, you don't get much more out of Leonard's comfort zone than the Soul Cairn. The only way you could have made it worse is if you just had things spitting at him the entire time. Of course, things get worse and worse until eventually Leonard is fighting a dragon, Durnehviir. I say Leonard is fighting a dragon. Two vampire ladies are fighting the dragon, and Leonard is hiding behind columns and shooting the dragon with a crossbow. This is my spot! Woo. Okay. You can have it! You can have it! Of course, the fight goes in their favour. Durnehviir is banished, but not dead. And this is where the power spike comes in. Most people probably don't even think of this when they play that DLC. Durnehviir gives you, a shout, essentially his name, that will let you summon him to Tamriel. And it's kind of cool, it's okay. He teaches you a new shout, and that's probably the biggest reason people want to bring him. But in actual fact, from a story perspective, this has just given Leonard a summonable dragon. Again, in the vanilla game, this probably means very little. Dragons are often weaker than half the other things you fight in Skyrim. But from the story's perspective, and with the mods that I was using, this is a major step up. I mean, this is a powerful ally. It is a dragon, an undead necromancer dragon. This is the power spike that would eventually allow Leonard to be able to fight other dragons. Now, I had remembered Durnehviir, and I did remember it ended up with the Dragonborn being able to summon Durnehviir. So I was aware of this power spike, and I'd given it some thought. And of course, the worry is, would Leonard just use this all the time? Would he have used it in the Civil War? Yes, he definitely would have used it if he knew there was a pitched battle coming. Yeah, he would have used it. Maybe. Although, he was worried that if he was summoning a dragon, people might start thinking he's responsible for the dragon attacks, which would have been the sort of thing people would say. So I don't know for sure if he would, but it might have been something he considered. But for most situations, probably not. A bandit jumps out and attacks him, or he gets attacked by a spider. It's probably easier to just go invisible and let Inigo shoot them, or to use a calm spell, that sort of thing. So I realized there were only a few instances where he would use the dragon. He wouldn't be able to use it in a dungeon, for example. And those instances would be when he's facing a creature that was as terrible as a dragon, i.e. another dragon. It was the perfect tool to use against the dragon. You know what they say, to use a thief to catch a thief? In this case, it was use a dragon to kill a dragon. And it worked perfectly in the end. I mean, I was a tiny bit worried when I realized this power spike was coming, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was going to help open things up, especially considering the museum quest line was currently stalled because there were 2 dragons that needed to be fought, and there was no way Leonard had the power before Chapter 7 to do that. But now with another dragon? Well, maybe. Of course, Leonard gets a chance to test that out, not willingly I might add, as part of the Dawnguard questline itself. He ends up having to fight 2 dragons, and that's probably when the thought enters his head that he can fight 2 dragons if he can summon another dragon. Not there and then. The thoughts that sprang to his head at that moment were probably, ah! But you know, afterwards, he probably thought a little bit more rationally. And so that brings us to Chapter 8, where Leonard puts together an elite dragon-slaying team. An undead dragon, the last of the Snow Elves, a daughter of Cold Harbour, a blue-furred hero with destiny written all over him, a wild killing machine tamed at birth and then turned into an even wilder killing machine with armour, and finally, a cow. We have a cow. Individually, you are creatures of power, forces of nature, but together... Seriously, why do we have a cow? They successfully vanquish the dragons, although in the process they do lose Terence the Troll, and now the museum quest lines can continue. And so that's what actually happened throughout Chapter 8. Leonard basically was travelling all over Skyrim, doing various different quest lines associated with the museum, including things like Much Ado About Snow Elves, the safe houses ones, which actually involved a fair amount of dragon fighting, which was now an option, and also took him to areas where he could do some non-museum related quests, but things that he knew might get him more relics. So it was actually quite a busy chapter where a lot of things got done. But this chapter is where it became massively obvious that Leonard was becoming a lot more powerful. I mean, being able to summon Durnehviir definitely allowed him to take on quite a few dragons in that chapter, and I mean, it was still tough, but it was manageable. It was something that Leonard now had the tools to deal with and felt, I wouldn't say comfortable doing, but was willing to do for the rewards that were being offered. Because that's Leonard's thought process. Is the risk I am taking worth it for the reward I am getting? And now the risks were a lot lower because he had his own dragon. But Durnehviir was not the only new weapon in Leonard's arsenal. At the end of Chapter 6, Leonard had finally reached a high enough level in illusion to begin learning expert spells, and this includes invisibility. So he starts Chapter 8 with the invisibility spell, and of course this further trivializes the stealth for Leonard. I mean, he was already pretty much going wherever he wanted and rarely getting discovered, if ever, to be honest. But the invisibility spell just took it to the next level. He didn't have to rely on invisibility potions, which did have some limitations in that he could only carry a certain number of potions. And of course, every time he picked something up, invisibility would drop, and he would rarely want to just keep chugging potions to stay invisible. With the invisibility spell, he could just keep casting it and stay invisible more or less all the time. At the same time, he was also becoming better at alteration and was finally able to cast spells like telekinesis, which seem like novelty spells when you play the game normally, but from a story perspective and for a character like Leonard, telekinesis is a massive tool in his box. This is something that allows him to take objects from very far away without having to, expose himself or set off any traps. Now, he doesn't always remember that spell, and sometimes wanders over a trap because he sees a shiny thing anyway, but he now has that option. And between invisibility and telekinesis, Leonard has now gone from being, a superb thief, the Grand Master of the Thieves Guild, the listener of the Dark Brotherhood, to basically a legendary Shadowblade kind of figure. His ability at stealth is not just borderline magical, it is now literally magical. This, of course, does mean there is no longer any tension in the stealth aspect of the game, but that is kind of inevitable in a role-playing game, especially if the character is very stealth-focused. It was always going to happen. There was going to be a certain point where Leonard could pretty much go wherever he wanted, completely unobserved. Fortunately for us, Leonard is no longer sneaking through people's houses, pilfering their valuables, or stabbing people in the back for a contract. Well, actually, no, he does occasionally still do that, but that's more as a hobby than... that sounds awful, doesn't it? But that's true. He's just keeping his hand in. He sort of enjoys the whole sneaking around, sweet rolling every city he comes to. But again, it's more just to keep the guild's coffers flowing, its influence growing, and, it's almost like meditation for him, yeah? It's therapeutic. As a side note, I want to talk about some tweaks I made to the Ordinator perk mod for my own personal use. And it is related because one of the perks I tweaked finally became available at the start of Chapter 8. And it took that long to become available because of the tweaks. This was actually a perk that originally Leonard would have been able to get as soon as he got 100 sneak. And I'm not totally sure when that happened, but it was definitely in Chapter 2, but it may have even been in Chapter 1. And it was the Shadow Warrior perk, which is a perk that essentially grants 2 seconds of invisibility and forces opponents to, abandon their search for you if they're far enough away. I felt like this was not just a powerful perk, but also just a little too mystical. It gave Leonard a sort of constant source of invisibility. Now, he could make alchemy potions that made him invisible, and he had the power from Nocturnal that gave him invisibility once per day, but this just felt too casual, too easy, and so I changed it so that it didn't just require sneak 90, it requires sneak 90, it also requires illusion 75, i.e. you need to be able to cast invisibility for this perk to be available. I also changed the Laughing Ghost perk, which is actually a very powerful power. It lets you teleport to an enemy if you're sneaking and stab them in the back. Now, Leonard is now at a point where if he can see someone, he can probably get to them and stab them in the back if he wants to. So it's probably not too overpowered, but it is pretty quick and pretty convenient. And again, I also felt it was a little too mystical. So I made it require Alteration 90 because there are several perks related to teleportation that are in the Alteration tree. So I figured this is a good compromise. And it was also something that I never thought Leonard would achieve. I honestly did not see Leonard getting mastery of alteration, so I felt like this would be out of his way. Obviously now it's not, so there is a possibility Leonard might look at this, but of course he is still very nervous of teleportation. And I changed a number of other perks. For example, there is a perk in Pickpocket where you can sleep with 50,000 gold on your person and exchange that gold for a perk point. It's called Dragon Horde, and I decided that you had to have reached a certain point in the main quest so that you were Dragonborn for that to make sense. And there is a perk in Illusion that lets you cast illusion spells on vampires, undead, automatons, etc. And you could get that at 70 illusion, and I really didn't like that. So I made it require 90 in illusion and also force you to be cross-competent in other trees. So for example, you needed 50 conjuration, you needed 50 restoration and 50 enchanting. My thought process there was, well, you know, restoration has spells to make the undead fear you. Conjuration allows you to control undead. It also allows you to control summoned creatures like Daedra. And enchanting and conjuration give you a knowledge of soul gem energy, which of course power the automatons, the Dwemer, centurions, etc. And thus you would have a better understanding of those magics and be able to tailor the illusion to such creatures to control their minds too. Again, never really saw Leonard getting there, but actually now it is possible, because I am continuing on with the Leonard story, even though his official, his official story arc is over. I am going to do some more chapters as a sort of epilogue. He might actually achieve that. That is possible, which is pretty powerful. But at that point, I mean, let's face it, none of those creatures pose any problems for Leonard anyway. So, that's it for Chapter 8, which of course ends with Orion sending Leonard off to Solstheim to acquire yet another relic. You want me to go to Solstheim? We've had this conversation. Solstheim, remember? There's a Dragonborn person there, Mirak. Kinda powerful, can control dragons. Oh, and incidentally wants me dead. Not a problem for you guys, then? Super powerful Dragonborn, wants me dead, can control dragons. No, fine. I'll go. I'll go to Solstheim. I will go to Solstheim, get myself killed, all for the sake of learning. Don't try and stop me. Really, they are not going to try and stop me. And honestly, there's not an awful lot to say about Chapter 9. I mean, it was a lot of fun. It was a great change of scenery. And I had tons to do there. I'd been picking up quests to find new relics, journals, etc. So there were tons of things I needed to visit, which gave me all the excuses I needed to basically exhaust that island. And of course, we got to see Leonard deal with Neloth, which, I don't know about you, is probably the highlight of the chapter for me. Oh, there was one little issue in this chapter that's actually related to Neloth, and that is Leonard's glowing bottom. Focus, man! My bottom is glowing, and I'm afraid I'm just going to have to insist.
My new steward is acceptable.
And I do mean insist.
If only he made better tea.
Stop talking about the tea, and remove this spell right now.
I wonder if a dragon could be captured alive. It would make a fascinating test subject.
I'm not going and killing a dragon for you. Well, I might. But not with a spell like this. I've got a glowing bottom. Listen to me, you aggravating man. Which he ended up realizing was due to Neloth. And this is actually true. The spell that Neloth cast upon him made Leonard's bottom glow. Now, I don't quite know why, but I think this spell has some object associated with it. And that object seems to hover in the center of the character. Invisibly, you cannot see it. It's inside your character. I don't know why it's there, why it was needed, and I've not investigated it much, so I couldn't even hazard a wild guess at all, actually. But one of the mods I was using added particle lights to certain things, and for some reason it had added a particle light to this, so I'm guessing it was a spell effect with particle lights inside Leonard, unfortunately placed very close to his posterior, and it would definitely move towards the edge of the posterior when he moved forward, which made his bottom glow even more. So this was a bit weird, to be honest. And whilst I did, consider fixing it, because it probably wouldn't have been that hard, I actually quite enjoyed the idea of it. For some reason, the idea that Neloth had cast a spell on Leonard and a side effect of it was to make his bottom glow kind of fits the whole quest narrative. It wouldn't be the first spell that Neloth had cast upon Leonard that had a side effect, but it also gave me a very good excuse to briefly visit Skyrim and get this quest done, because I actually have a feeling that had Leonard's bottom not glowed, he would not have gone on done that quest, the quest that required the spell, for Neloth. He really didn't have that much reason, and I think it would have blocked certain other quests that were kind of fun to do. So in actuality, this, shall we call it a bug, not only was it kind of funny and kind of appropriate, it did actually give me the reason needed to go through with that particular quest. But of course, the real story point for Chapter 9 is the fact that Leonard reaches whole new levels of power. Levels of power that will actually change his character. He started Chapter 9 being able to throw the Paralyze spell around, which is a very powerful spell. And throughout that chapter, he actually began to experiment in other areas of magic, because of course Neloth was an enchanter, and there was no enchanting service on the island, so Leonard had to learn some of the basics of enchanting from Neloth. He also got a little interested in conjuration because of the Conjure Greater Shelter, and so on and so forth. He was beginning to experiment even more in different avenues of magic. But the biggest thing, of course, was the Bend Will Shout. Gaining a shout that would allow him to control dragons. And this changes everything. Leonard is no longer the same character. He is now the last Dragonborn. He has the power to command dragons. It's going to change his outlook. It's going to change his plans. His earlier concerns of things like houses, thaneships, and even the museum are going to seem petty. He's going to move on to greater things. Well, he might finish some of the museum stuff. There are some displays that still need filling, right? It's not that he has to. He's not addicted to it. The museum is definitely not in control. He could walk away anytime he chose to. He's just choosing not to. Okay? But he could if he wanted to. He just doesn't want to.